It did not begin with drums or gunfire. There were no soldiers marching, no flags waving in defiance, and no crowds shouting in the streets. It began with a single sentence, spoken in a calm voice on national radio in Burkina Faso. The words were simple. "We don't need donations. We need you." There was no applause, no music, no celebration. Only silence followed, and yet that silence carried farther than anyone expected. Across North America and Europe, in quiet kitchens and crowded hospital corridors, the sentence echoed. A nurse in Canada set down her pager. A software engineer in California paused with his resignation letter still in his hand. A mother in Germany turned to her daughter and whispered, "It's time." Within 72 hours, flights were rerouted, terminals filled, and borders were reshaped not by governments, but by people choosing to return. Burkina Faso's airports did not welcome tourists or wealthy elites. They welcomed builders, healers, planners, and dreamers. Men and women who had lived decades abroad, many of them already successful by every outside measure, packed their belongings and came home. They did not return because they had failed in the West. They returned because, for the first time in years, someone in power spoke to their dignity instead of their debt. At the arrivals gate, a neurosurgeon left the comfort of modern hospitals for dusty rural clinics. A computer coder who once secured Western networks prepared to design offline systems for villages. A fashion designer who once worked the runways of Milan carried bolts of fabric printed with ancestral proverbs. None came for wealth or comfort, all came for conviction. And yet one question remains. How could a single sentence move so many lives at once? What did they hear in that moment of silence that convinced them to leave everything behind and come home? If one calm voice on a radio could summon thousands, what might it be awakening in us today? What unfolded in those first 72 hours was unlike anything the world had seen in decades. Airports across Burkina Faso, once quiet and often half empty, became the stage for something unexpected. Planes touched down not with tourists or business elites, but with returning sons and daughters of the nation. They arrived carrying laptops, medical kits, sewing machines, textbooks, and even handfuls of soil wrapped in cloth. It was not migration, it was restoration. Numbers tell part of the story. In less than 2 months, more than 8,000 highly trained professionals returned from Europe, North America, and Asia. Doctors and nurses who had kept intensive care units running in Toronto and Philadelphia now stood in village clinics with cracked walls and bare floors. Engineers who once designed software for Western corporations unpacked servers and solar routers to build data networks that could function offline. Agronomists carried ancestral seed strains back to rural farms and taught new irrigation systems based on humidity sensors. Teachers returned with lesson plans that placed African writers beside European classics. Each person represented both knowledge and purpose. The economic weight of this movement was staggering. Analysts estimated that if every returning professional created just 5 to 10 local jobs, Burkina Faso could gain between 40,000 and 80,000 new positions in the early months alone. In terms of human capital, the value of these skilled workers exceeded $400 million per year if measured by Western salary standards. Yet no one came because of a paycheck. They came because they had heard a call to dignity. The stories at the airport captured this truth better than numbers ever could. A young woman stepped off a flight from Paris, carrying rolled-up blueprints for a maternity ward she had dreamed of since childhood. A man in a gray coat held nothing but a bag of soil from his village, wrapped in cloth like a sacred relic. A soldier on duty saluted a nurse still wearing her hospital badge from Oslo. Immigration officers abandoned rigid protocol to help elderly women down the steps of the jet bridge. Inside the arrival halls, disbelief gave way to determination. Not one person had been offered money. Not one had been promised land. They came because they were finally seen. In one corner of the terminal, a teenage robotics engineer embraced a woman in traditional dress who whispered, "You are finally home." He nodded with tears in his eyes. At that same moment, in Bobo Dioulasso, families cleared land for a trauma center before the first stone had even been laid. A local farmer handed his grandfather's spade to a young agronomist and said, "This tool will dig deeper in your hands than it ever did in mine." In the capital, a group of young men unpacked servers and worked through power outages, coding by candlelight to build a firewall network independent from foreign internet providers. Others returned to heal cultural wounds, as well as physical ones. A fashion designer once celebrated on the runways of Milan painted the walls of a broken warehouse bright yellow and turned it into a design school for village girls. A doctor walked through a crumbling rural clinic, ran her hand along a cracked wall, and declared, "We will build here." Within days, truckloads of cement and timber arrived, not from foreign donors, but from volunteers and neighbors. Grandmothers brought bowls of ground nuts and stories about birth traditions that textbooks once dismissed. Musicians gathered at the National Radio Building to record songs that blended ancient rhythms with modern voices of resistance. Their lyrics carried a message that spoke louder than statistics. We came not for gold, but for the soil beneath it. What made this moment unique was the absence of foreign logos and international press. No one arrived to wave a flag of sponsorship. The government did not orchestrate a campaign. It simply opened the gates, processed papers quickly, and reallocated land where needed. This was not aid. It was ownership. It was a population deciding, on its own terms, to return and rebuild. Yet as inspiring as these early days were, one question hung in the air. Was this sudden wave of return a spark that would fade with time, or had it already lit a fire that could reshape the destiny of an entire nation? The first wave of arrivals carried with it more than tools and textbooks. It carried a surge of emotion that swept across villages, cities, and even foreign capitals. Burkina Faso had seen people return before, but never like this. This was not a trickle of refugees escaping hardship abroad. It was a flood of doctors, coders, farmers, and teachers who came back willingly, carrying not despair, but determination. That difference made all the difference. At Ouagadougou International Airport, crowds pressed against barriers, straining to catch a glimpse of the new arrivals. They were not celebrities or politicians. They were sons and daughters, neighbors and classmates who had once left and were now walking back through the gates. A soldier in uniform saluted a nurse from Norway. A group of school children cheered when a young teacher returned with a satchel filled with bilingual lesson plans. A girl in her teens hugged her uncle, a robotics engineer, and whispered with pride, "Now I know we can build our own future." The atmosphere carried the energy of a festival, but without music or fireworks. Instead, it was filled with the quiet awe of people realizing that history was unfolding before their eyes. In Bobo Dioulasso, markets renamed stalls after returnees who had once been celebrated abroad. In Kaya, villagers brought water and food to construction sites where new clinics and schools rose from cracked ground. Across the country, people who had been told for decades that their best hope lay outside its borders were suddenly reminded that hope could be rebuilt at home. The government's reaction was cautious but supportive. Housing documents were processed quickly, land was reallocated to families, and professional qualifications gained abroad were fast-tracked for recognition. Leaders did not present themselves as masterminds of the movement. Instead, they stood aside, understanding that the legitimacy of this rebirth came from the people themselves. For once, power was not claiming credit, it was making space. But the most striking reaction came from President Ibrahim Traoré himself. He did not appear on giant billboards or in choreographed rallies. He did not thunder with promises. Instead, he stayed steady, repeating the same simple conviction. The nation did not need charity. It needed its people. For those returning, this was not just a slogan. It was validation. They had been told for decades that they were migrants, outsiders, and temporary guests in foreign lands. To hear their leader call them necessary was like the opening of a long locked door. Beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, however, the mood was different. In Brussels, policymakers described the return wave as destabilizing and impossible to manage. A private memo leaked from Washington warned that American hospitals could face severe shortages if African doctors left en masse. Parisian talk shows debated angrily about whether Africa should be allowed to reclaim its skilled workforce, as if dignity were a commodity to be negotiated. Berlin think tanks quietly drafted proposals to offer scholarships tied to contracts that discouraged graduates from going home. These international reactions revealed the true stakes of the movement. For decades, Western nations had quietly benefited from the brain drain, building hospitals, labs, and tech companies with African talent. Now that talent was flowing back. The world's unease was not only about the numbers, it was about the narrative. If a small country like Burkina Faso could reverse the direction of migration, then larger nations across Africa might do the same. And if they did, the leverage of aid, trade deals, and visa policies would no longer carry the same weight. Inside Burkina Faso, meanwhile, the returnees and the communities receiving them reached an emotional peak. Elders cried openly at bonfires as they told stories to young engineers about rivers and ancestors. Children danced in the streets to new songs recorded by returning musicians. A farmer handed a returning agronomist a cracked wooden spade, saying, "This will dig deeper in your hands than in mine." In a yellow-painted warehouse, young girls sketched fashion designs under the guidance of a woman who had once been called a miracle in Milan. A doctor traced the outline of a broken clinic wall and declared, "Here we build." These moments were not staged. They were lived. The high point of this wave was not measured in policy, but in spirit. Markets renamed themselves after returning heroes. Schools adopted new mottos that read, "Return and rebuild." Local radio stations aired testimonies from nurses and teachers who described their choice to come home. One nurse, speaking live on air, wept as she explained how she delivered a baby with her bare hands, remembering that she had once worked in a European hospital with 10 incubators. She ended her broadcast with the words, "This is why I came back." But as the music of hope spread through the villages, another sound began to echo from abroad, the sound of nervous debates in policy rooms and embassies. If thousands could return in only a few weeks, what would happen if the trend continued across an entire continent? Could the world absorb the shock of Fatrika, reclaiming its people? The question hung heavy in the air. Would this movement be remembered as a passing surge of emotion, or was it the beginning of a tide that no government could stop? As the days turned into weeks, the return movement began to reshape the daily life of Burkina Faso. What started with crowded airports soon reached the smallest villages, the most remote clinics, and the busiest markets. The effect was visible not only in buildings rising from the dust, but in the rhythm of society itself. Families that once dreamed of visas now celebrated land deeds. Conversations that had been filled with talk of departure now focused on building where people stood. The social impact was immediate. Schools reopened with fresh energy. Teachers who had studied abroad introduced lesson plans that included African heroes alongside European figures. Children who had once memorized only foreign names now learned about their own poets, scientists, and freedom fighters. A grandmother in Bobo Dioulasso began teaching night classes in ancestral proverbs so that returning children could reconnect with the roots of their culture. They know the alphabet, she said, but they must now learn the root. Healthcare also changed. Clinics that had been abandoned for years came back to life. Doctors and midwives set up delivery rooms with solar-powered fridges and handmade beds. A maternal clinic named Simply Ours opened in a remote district, co-founded by a local imam and a trauma nurse who had just returned from Canada. No ribbon cutting, no foreign plaque, just service. In the capital, hospitals began producing their own diagnostic kits instead of waiting for international shipments. Rural clinics used new decentralized systems to trace and share essential medicines. For the first time in decades, access to healthcare expanded without dependence on donor clauses or foreign consultants. Politically, the movement transformed the way power operated. Parliament passed a bill called Roots-Based Governance, requiring that all major development projects include local elders, artisans, midwives, and farmers alongside engineers and economists. This was not symbolic. It gave a voice to those who had been excluded for generations. Ministers who dismissed the return as a passing trend were quietly replaced by those who supported it. Mayors began holding town meetings under trees, surrounded by farmers and builders instead of behind closed office doors. One woman who had returned from Canada was elected council leader after building a bridge that had been promised for 10 years. Her campaign slogan was just one sentence: "You have seen what I did." Economically, the effects were striking. Farmers who once struggled under foreign contracts now joined local cooperatives led by returnees. Within weeks, a logistics union created by engineers replaced a European contractor. The result was a 40% increase in profit margins for local farmers. Markets renamed stalls after returning specialists. Billboards once dominated by telecom advertisements now showed the faces of local doctors and teachers who had come back to serve. One poster featured a little girl in a lab coat with the words, "I do not dream of leaving anymore." Civil society bloomed alongside the economy. Community labs, trauma centers, and maker spaces appeared in buildings that had stood empty for years. Village podcasts discussed policy in local dialects. Poets began publishing in ancestral alphabets. Radio stations broadcast lectures from elders side by side with technical talks from young engineers. National holidays also changed in tone. Independence Day no longer focused on military parades. Instead, it celebrated local innovation. One year, students unveiled a solar-powered desalination system at the city center, explaining the science in 3 languages to cheering crowds. All of these changes carried a clear message. Burkina Faso was no longer waiting for aid. It was building for itself. It was rewriting policy and reshaping culture without permission from abroad. The state did not stand above the people. It stood beside them. Citizens who had once viewed government with fatigue and fear now looked with expectation. They had seen that leadership could be practical and participatory. They knew what was possible when the right hands held the tools. Yet this transformation also raised deeper questions. Rapid change rarely happens without resistance. If the return movement continued to grow, how would it affect regional stability in the Sahel? Would neighboring governments support this vision of sovereignty? Or would they fear it spreading across their own borders? The answer was not yet clear. What was clear was that Burkina Faso had awakened something powerful, and the world was beginning to take notice. While the people of Burkina Faso were building clinics and schools with their own hands, the rest of the world was watching with growing unease. In Washington, policy analysts reviewed reports warning that the return of African doctors and nurses could strain American hospitals. Cities like Philadelphia and New York had long relied on immigrant professionals to keep healthcare systems functioning. The possibility that thousands might go home willingly unsettled officials who had never imagined such a reversal. Internal memos began using new terms like reverse drain and migration threat index. A task force was even created to track African return movements using artificial intelligence and sentiment analysis. In Europe, the reaction was no less anxious. Brussels described the wave of return as destabilizing and impossible to manage. Paris television panels argued heatedly about whether Africa should be allowed to reclaim its talent at the expense of Europe. In Berlin, migration institutes quietly proposed offering elite scholarships tied to contracts that discouraged graduates from returning home. The fear was not only about losing skilled workers, it was about losing influence. For decades, European aid and visa policies had served as levers of control. Now, those levers seemed to be slipping. At the International Monetary Fund and other global institutions, the tone was cautious. Officials did not openly condemn the movement because it was voluntary and rooted in hope rather than crisis. But in closed meetings, they warned that if Burkina Faso's model spread, conditional aid would lose its power. Diplomats in Geneva admitted quietly that this was a challenge to the old order of dependency. President Ibrahim Traoré's measured response only deepened the concern abroad. When pressed by foreign delegations about the strain on budgets and global labor markets, he replied calmly, "You had them for 30 years. Let us have them for 1 generation." His words were not a rejection. They were a redefinition. The statement did not make front-page headlines in the West, but it struck a chord across Africa, where leaders and citizens alike heard something rare in modern politics: dignity spoken without apology. And so a question began to form in policy rooms from Washington to Brussels. If one of the smallest nations in West Africa could set this example, what would happen if others followed? Could the balance of global power shift not through conflict, but through return flights and rebuilt communities? By the end of the 3rd week, no one could deny what had happened. This was no temporary surge. It was not nostalgia or a passing wave of emotion. It was a shift in national life. Clinics that had been silent for decades were filled with voices again. Schools once abandoned now echoed with lessons in 3 languages. Fields that had dried under the sun began to grow with new irrigation systems designed by returnees. The diaspora was no longer an audience watching from afar. It had become the builder, the healer, the teacher, and the dreamer on the ground. Yet with hope came warning. Rapid transformation always invites resistance. Already, whispers from international institutions hinted at new policies, stricter visas, and revised aid agreements designed to slow the momentum. In Washington, diplomats asked how long this could last. In Brussels, officials worried that other African nations might follow. Even in Paris, commentators admitted that Europe might be facing the loss of leverage it had held for 50 years. The return movement was not just about Burkina Faso. It was a signal that the old order could be challenged without war, simply by people choosing to walk home. So the questions remain. Is President Ibrahim Traoré building a foundation for lasting unity? Or is he risking new divisions under the weight of expectation? Can Burkina Faso maintain stability while reshaping itself so quickly? And perhaps the most important question of all, if this can happen here, what might happen if other nations remember their strength in the same way? The future is not guaranteed. If regional alliances in the Sahel fail to hold firm within the next few months, Burkina Faso may face intervention or renewed pressure from outside powers. But if the movement continues to grow, it could mark the beginning of a new era where sovereignty is measured not in aid received, but in roots reclaimed. If this story has touched something in your heart, let it guide your reflection. Ask yourself what dignity, family, and justice mean in your own life. Share your thoughts so that your voice becomes part of this conversation. Africa's awakening is not just its story. It is a reminder to the world that ordinary people, when called by purpose, can shape destiny itself. We will meet again in the next story, where the truth continues to rise. May God bless Africa, the land of strength, hope, and an unbreakable will.